Now look, if you watch one video about this new bike, the Triumph Tiger Sport 660, then please make it this one. Because not only have we got the finished production model here so I can give you the full lowdown, but a couple of months ago, I actually got to ride one of the final prototype bikes on some of the roads around here used by the Triumph test riders. So first up, I'm going to give you the full specs and details and price, and at the end of this video, I'm going to tell you exactly how it feels on the road and how it compares to its closest competition. But before we get started, I think they've done an incredible job again at the styling here, so let's take a good look at it.
But I think to truly gauge whether Triumph have succeeded with this bike, we've first got to understand why it exists and who it's for. You see, up until now, they've really focused on the more premium end of the motorcycle market, while at the same time, some of the Japanese manufacturers have been selling more affordable bikes in huge numbers. Take the Yamaha MT-07 for example, which has been the best-selling bike in the naked class since its launch in 2014. With over 125,000 sold in Europe alone, that many at just under $7,000 means about £850 million in revenue. Now look, that's a very crude calculation with plenty of detail omitted, but the point is, it's big business. And on top of that, it's also provided the platform from which they've spun out a whole bunch of other types of bike. There's the retro XSR 700, the Tenere 700 adventure bike, the sports touring Tracer 7, and most recently, their R7 Supersport. And Kawasaki took the same approach with their Z650, a solid, affordable naked in its own right, but also sharing its essentials with the Versys 650, Ninja 650, and now the retro Z650 RS. So as you can see, repurposing the engine and much of the chassis is a super efficient way of covering many genres of competitively priced bikes. So earlier this year, Triumph took action, launching their own MT-07 and Z650 rival, the Trident 660. And by all accounts, they made a pretty damn good job of it. The triple-cylinder engine, sharp handling, and relatively generous tech have all been widely praised by the press. And the price point seems tempting enough for the market as well. In fact, it's been the best-selling mid-capacity bike in the UK almost every month since launch. But today, we're on to the next chapter of this platform's journey with the new Tiger Sport 660. This taller, fared bike will compete directly with the other financially attainable sports tourers like the Tracer 7 and Versys 650. Naturally, it carries over a lot of the features that have made the Trident a huge success, and so here are 4 areas in which it's pretty much the same bike. The 660 triple in the Tiger remains unchanged, so you still get the same peak power as the Trident with 80 horses at 10,250 RPM. Torque figures are also identical with 64 Nm produced at 6,250, and over 90% of it's available right from 3,600 up to 9,750, so that should make it an ideal match for this kind of bike that demands everyday usability over purely chasing top-end revvy power. Now there are some adaptations to the frame which we'll get onto in a minute, but fundamentally the idea is the same with a tubular steel construction and a steel swing arm too. This helps to keep the cost down for Triumph and in turn the customer, as opposed to something lighter yet more expensive like the aluminium frame and swing arm of the Street Triple lineup. So yes, it might be a couple of kilos heavier, but the geometry and weight distribution are typical Triumph. I'd say the Trident is the best handling bike in its class, and so I'd expect the same from the Tiger. Now another factor is the suspension setup, and here you get the same 41mm upside down fork and preload adjustable monoshock, both provided by Showa. They do get their own settings though, and a little more height and travel. You also get the 2-pot Nissin brakes on 310mm discs, and it rolls on the same 5-spoke wheels with the excellent Michelin Road 5 tires fitted as standard. Now the housing of the dash has been redesigned to fit in with the new bike's more modern aesthetic, but underneath it's technically the same, and that's a very good thing. The top half is a really punchy inverted LCD which contains all of the usual basic riding information, but beneath it is a modestly sized TFT screen, and it manages to pack in a surprising amount of features, especially if you opt for the Bluetooth connectivity module accessory. That opens up navigation prompts, media playback, and phone call and message handling, all all neatly integrated with the switchgear and dash. On top of that, you get the same two riding modes of road and rain, both of which affect the throttle response, traction control, and ABS to suit the conditions. The traction control is also switchable, which is of course handy if you find it too invasive or for performing wheelies or burnouts. So the fundamentals of the two bikes are very similar, but as Miles Perkins, head of brand at Triumph, explains here, a sports tourer like the Tiger Sport 660 really has a different customer in mind.
With the Trident, you were super clear that you were kind of going after people who it might be their first big bike or a second bike for more experienced bikers. Is this offering something a little bit different? Is it a different market that might be interested in the Tiger?
Yeah, the similarities are middleweight and possibly your first big bike, but actually this category I think is broader. The bikes that this goes up against and what the riders who buy them are after is a broader versatility than the Trident's world. So this is a much more all-round motorcycle proposition. So fit it with luggage and you can go touring on it. A bit more of an upright seating position, which I think makes it an even better city bike or a commute or a weekend sort of away kind of bike. So it's similar in terms of why would this stand out, but it's broader in terms of what people would want from it.
And so with that, here are 6 differences from the Trident that make the Tiger Sport more of an all-rounder. This new front end gives the bike a modern aesthetic that's more in line with the previous Tiger Sports than it is the semi-retro Trident. But the new fairing also provides some much-needed wind protection for longer stints in the saddle. And the windscreen is height adjustable with a new single-handed mechanism, so you can push it down to cool off around town or pull it right up if it's cold and wet on the motorway. And in terms of comfort, it also helps to be sat up high with a little more room to stretch out. Triumph have done this by raising the seat height from 805mm on the Trident to 834 on the Tiger Sport. On top of that, the bars are wider and there's now 35mm more room between the saddle and pegs. This opens up the knee angle, and so that's great news for taller riders who fancied a Trident but found it too small. Now that taller suspension plus some tweaks to the rake and a longer swing arm combine for a bike that has a little more presence overall. The wheelbase is longer and there's extra weight too, 206 kilograms wet as opposed to the 189 of the Trident, which you'd expect with the extra bodywork and size. It's not the lightest bike in the class, but still not bad. Now part of it will be down to the increase in fuel capacity with 17 litres now from the 14 of the Trident. That's a welcome boost for anyone looking to take it touring, and with Triumph's quoted consumption figures, it should be good for well over 200 miles between stops. So again, not the class leader, but certainly competitive. Another weight factor will be the subframe, which has been beefed up to cope with a passenger and full 3-piece luggage. So whereas the Trident has a pretty small pillion seat and grab rails only come as an accessory, this bike is much more roomy and has grab rails as standard. It's also worth adding that the preload adjustment is done with a remote knob, so no need to get a spanner out when you want to jack it up for carrying a passenger. The luggage I just mentioned is part of the new accessories lineup, with colour-matched side cases and a top box that can take 2 lids. There are some other nice Tiger-specific bits like the peripheral lights and belly pan, as well as the best of the Trident accessories like the quick shifter, Bluetooth module, heated grips, and USB socket. So on paper, it looks pretty good, but in reality, it's going to need a little extra to change those existing buying habits.
And there are some pretty established bikes in this sort of category with quite dedicated customers as well. So what is it about this bike out on the road that's going to make it stand out and perhaps sway people away from those?
Well, I think the facts stack up very well. So more power, TFT instruments, riding modes, switchable traction control, which are 2 of the bikes that this goes against doesn't have. Lowest cost of ownership in the category. So facts-wise, that's what makes it stand out. But for me, it'll be the ride. So a triple engine has got a characteristic to itself. It sounds awesome. All the competitors are twins. So down low, this has got the torque, but versus a twin, the mid-range and the top-end power would mean that the Triumph Triple is really going to deliver performance that you can't get. And the sound and the characteristic of that's one thing. Another thing that Triumph, I think, do very well, I know I work for Triumph, but you know, I buy Triumph, I've bought Triumphs my whole life, is the quality of the finish and the detailing, and also the quality of the handling. I've ridden this versus the competitors myself, and the nature of the neutrality in the handling, how it corners, what it feels like when you're accelerating, you know, and putting the engine under load. All those characteristics, for me, absolutely stand out. Abstract of the numbers, just the nature of what it feels like to ride.
Now, normally we'd have to take their word for it until the press launch, but this time I've been lucky enough to test out those claims firsthand. You see, Triumph invited me to the factory for the day in order to film an external opinion for their own launch video, but here on my own channel, I can give you my full, unfiltered opinion. Absolutely everything I say in that video is true. Having very recently ridden the Versys and Tracer, I can wholeheartedly say that the Tiger Sport feels easily the most lively. Factually, it has the most power, but for sporty road riding, the Triple just has a great revvy feel and a brilliant soundtrack too. On top of that, for motorway cruising, it's very smooth, which is a massive advantage to the Triumph. The handling feels like the best of the bunch to me as well, and we really got to test it thoroughly. For some of these shots, we had to take the same sequence of corners 3 or 4 times, and so I really got to grips with it, and it feels just as composed and agile as the Trident, and that's high praise indeed. In the cockpit, even on the prototype, there was a more considered approach to the finish. Everything is neat and there are nice touches and logos here and there. The windscreen is good in terms of coverage, and the new adjustment mechanism is an improvement even on the Tiger 900s. And then the tech, as we've mentioned, is better than the competition. The dash is brilliant, and although the road conditions were pretty easy going on that day, it is nice to have that rain mode in your back pocket, especially if you're a year-round commuter or a less experienced rider. Now, there are a couple of missing features I'd like to have seen though. One is cruise control, which is almost a must for me on a motorway-focused bike, and the other is more adjustability in the suspension. It was beautifully set up for solo riding, but I'll be interested to find out if the exact same fork settings, given there's no adjustment, can cope with the passenger and luggage heavy on the brakes. But I've got to admit, after riding it, I was expecting the Tiger Sport 660 to be a good wedge more cash than the Tracer, which I'd say is really its closest rival. But today, they revealed the pricing and it's not a huge amount more. Especially if you financed it, as a lot of folks do, the monthly difference would become almost unnoticeable. And they've done that by being shrewd about what to include and what not to include. If it was 500 quid more, not only would it be a difficult sell versus the Tracer, but you'd be nudging the price of some very appetizing bigger bikes, Triumphs included. The Trident is a similar story, a touch more than the MT-07, but justifiably for the engine, handling and tech. From the sales figures, it looks like they've judged that one perfectly, and so I wouldn't be surprised at all if they've got another winner on their hands here.